Hello and welcome to Act 2, Scene 2. Here we're going to ask the question, how far the patriarchal society is responsible for Lady Macbeth not killing Duncan, and what that has to do with fate. So our crucial quotation here is this one. I laid their daggers ready. He could not miss 'em. Had he not resembled my father as he slept, I had done't. So this is Lady Macbeth, who had a plan to kill Duncan. She's gone in, drugged the grooms, taken both their daggers, and has tried to kill Duncan, but she could not go through it. Why? She says it's because Duncan looks like her father. Now you will know, I hope, that patriarchal comes from the Latin word pater, and the Latin word pater means father. So a patriarchal society is one in which fathers have all the power. So Shakespeare is pointing out that Lady Macbeth can't achieve her own destiny and choose to become king because she choose to become queen because she cannot get rid of the father figure. So Shakespeare is partly criticising that society because he's saying women cannot achieve power that way. Alternatively, you could argue that he is criticising Lady Macbeth and suggesting that all women should keep their place in the patriarchal society, and not to keep their place is just as horrible as trying to kill your own father. Now, the other reference that Shakespeare is making is to Oedipus. He is the savage young man in this picture who is killing Laius out of pride, really. So Laius is a king who's riding his chariot along with his guards, and Oedipus has just arrived in his country, doesn't know that Laius is the king, but realises this old man is challenging him, and he refuses to budge out of the way. Laius drives his chariot towards him, and Oedipus kills the whole lot of them. Now, what he doesn't know is that he's been adopted, and Laius is actually his father, his real father. This leads to great anger amongst the gods when poor old Oedipus ends up marrying Laius's wife, Oedipus's real mother. Now, what's going on here is Shakespeare is pointing out how unnatural it is to murder your father, and also that it will lead to tragedy. Lady Macbeth knows this myth, she's deeply familiar with it, and therefore that's another reason why she won't kill Duncan. She knows that killing Duncan will inevitably lead to tragedy. Macbeth is also under the influence of the patriarchal society, and when he kills Duncan, he kills off his female self. He becomes too masculine, and this is revealed in his imagery. First, we have this wonderful idea where he imagines that he has murdered Sleep. Methought I heard a voice cry, "Sleep no more! Macbeth does murder Sleep, the innocent Sleep." So we can see this idea of what he's done is starting to overtake his mind with the repetition of sleep, sleep, sleep in a triplet. We can also see sleep beginning the third line. That is a trochaic stress. He's stressing that first syllable, which, as you know, shows his mental state. He's broken with the iambic pentameter. And then he launches into this beautiful personification where he imagines Sleep as a woman that every night knits up the unravelled sleeve of care. So he imagines that during the day we put on this imaginary woolen clothing, and the sleeve starts to unravel. The day never goes as you would expect, and it leaves you with worries, with care. But sleep gets rid of your worries because it repairs the damage of the day. It takes the unravelled wool and knits it back up. So he sees sleep as a restorative presence, but also a female one, and he has killed that female sense. and that female self. Now there's a delightful irony that's going on here, because we all assume that Macbeth shall sleep no more, as he says later. But actually, when we get towards the end of the play and the famous sleepwalking scene with Lady Macbeth, she is the one who becomes fixated with the blood on her hands, and it's Lady Macbeth who keeps sleepwalking, unable to sleep. Whereas Macbeth is in an entirely separate chamber, able to sleep all night. He never sees his wife sleepwalk. And so the irony is that although he kills Duncan partly to make his wife queen and to satisfy her, he does the opposite. He destroys Lady Macbeth by killing Duncan, and it's Lady Macbeth who shall sleep no more. This irony brings us back to the way that Greek tragedy was always set up. In Greek tragedy, the hero, the one with the fatal flaw, always tries to escape their fate, but whatever they do brings that fate about. And Shakespeare plays with that idea, where he brings his own terrible fate about, but also his wife's fate. The irony here, of course, is that this is a fate that she doesn't want, but he brings it about anyway, by giving her the fate that she does want, which is to become queen. Lady Macbeth's imagery when Macbeth refuses to go back and take the daggers because he's brought them with him. Let's see how Lady Macbeth would read this. A modern audience would give the stress on give. Give me the daggers. But this is iambic pentameter. So she will be saying, give me the daggers, the sleeping and the dead. And so she emphasizes the word the and the, which means that dead is unstressed. In other words, she's saying it's not important that Duncan is dead. Don't stress about it, Macbeth. She's also saying, put me in charge, which is why she emphasizes me. So she has to become much more masculine. But in order to do that, she's got to pretend that the sleeping and the dead are but as pictures. But of course the sleeping Duncan was not like a picture. It was too much like her father. Perhaps because she realizes her own weakness even as she says this, she then attacks Macbeth for being like a child, for fearing a painted devil. Now this is quite interesting. So here we have a medieval picture with a devil in it. Notice that they didn't have the idea of a single devil, Satan, portrayed in art. It could be any kind of demon. And really what Lady Macbeth is doing is suggesting that, perhaps these stories told by the church are just stories to keep us in our place. Well, the irony is that, of course, she is deeply religious, and when we see her sleepwalking at the end of the play, she fears for her own soul. She's convinced that her soul is going to go to hell. Whereas Macbeth does not seem to worry about hell at all, and does not fear the devil. So ironically, he ends up agreeing with what Lady Macbeth says here, but of course she doesn't. Now, why does Shakespeare put this in here? It's to make Lady Macbeth seem so much worse in his time, because not only is she murdering for ambition, she's deliberately going against Christian teaching. She's rejecting God, and the devil is supposed to be the thing that stops you turning away from God, thinking about hell, and she's just belittled the idea of hell by likening it to a childhood fear. This is why Shakespeare makes sure that at the end of the play, everybody knows she's definitely going to hell, because a Christian audience will demand that punishment. Now, the second political reason for the punishment is she is being punished for rejecting her patriarchal role and becoming masculine in taking action. And so she's got to be eradicated from this society because she is a woman who is rejecting patriarchal rule. Now, when Macbeth notices the blood of Duncan on his hands, He asks himself a question: will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? Now he turns to Neptune in a really interesting way. Neptune, of course, is a pre-Christian god. So once Macbeth has killed Duncan, he turns away from any ideas of Christianity. Now this is going to be important because by the end of the play you might decide he has lost his Christian faith and he doesn't really fear going to hell at all. One of the reasons he might kill Duncan is that he doesn't believe there is a divine punishment from God. Another reason could be that he sees life as the Romans did, a tragedy, and he can't see a way of escaping his own tragedy, and so he simply murders Duncan in order to get what he wants now, even though he knows he will have a tragic end because that's how tragedies work. He also picks on the idea of Neptune, not just because he represents the sea, but as you can see here, during Shakespeare's time and before, it was really common to build grand statues within a fountain, and the statue would be of Neptune providing water. Now, the image of using water to cleanse you of your sins, of course, is a Christian one, which we associate with baptism. But Macbeth rejects the Christian idea of baptism and turns to a pagan god, Neptune. On the one hand, this marks him out as a deviant in his society who deserves to be punished. But on the other hand, Shakespeare could be asking us to question the role of God. Because if we do live out tragic fates, then we're not really living a life of free will as promised in the Bible. So if you accept the idea that our lives are controlled and we have destiny and fate, then you don't really find an easy way to marry that with a Christian belief, because the Christian God doesn't work that way. There is no way of knowing, of course, if Shakespeare had atheistic beliefs, but I like to entertain that interpretation, and besides, it will give you a higher grade in your exam. You should also spot by now that this line is 11 syllables, and so is this. When Macbeth breaks the iambic pentameter and increases the number of syllables, we can see that this symbolises how his mind is affected by what he's done. So Shakespeare clearly shows us that at this moment, Macbeth's mind is damaged by having killed King Duncan, and that obviously leads to his propaganda point that you will be driven mad if you consider regicide. This, of course, is to protect King James from the nobles who are watching this play entertaining ideas of trying to usurp him or assassinate him. Emasculate her husband, to take away his masculinity. And she criticises him as a coward, which is why she describes him as having a white heart, like the white of surrender. She also deliberately links this back to the milk of human kindness that she disliked in him at the beginning of the play. Milk, you will know, is white. But what she's also doing here is saying she would shame to wear a heart so white. And actually this is prophetic. This is the ironic bit, because she's actually making a prediction, a prophecy, because that's how she ends up. She ends up with the white, innocent heart that feels so guilty at what it's done, and so she goes and commits suicide. And before that, she can't sleep. She's sleepwalking. Macbeth doesn't have that problem at all. He sleeps fine when Lady Macbeth is sleepwalking. And he doesn't really feel guilt at the end. He feels frustration that he can't outwit his fate and that he can't defeat the witch's prophecies, but he never feels guilty about what he's done, unless you count the words he says to Macduff when he says, my hands are too much charged with blood of thine already. And so we might say he probably does feel guilty about slaughtering Macduff's family, but there's nothing else he seems to feel guilty about. at the end of the play. Of course, during the course of the journey, like here, he feels guilty about having killed Duncan. He's terrified by guilt once he's killed Banquo and therefore sees Banquo's ghost. But once he gets to the end of the play, he's lost the fear that his guilt supplied him, and he no longer feels guilty. It's quite interesting, at the end, perhaps Macbeth chooses to die because he can no longer feel these emotions anymore, whereas Lady Macbeth chooses to die because she does feel these emotions. Anyway, about now you probably want to know why I've got this picture of a medieval knight jousting. Well, that's where the idea of wearing a heart comes from. Now, the reason that's ironic is that Lady Macbeth is imagining herself in the male role again as a knight. And the knight would actually wear a heart, an emblem from a lady in the stands. So she would give it to him probably at the end of his jousting spear, his lance. And he would take that and put it around his arm, so that he would be fighting not just for his own honour, but for the honour of a lady. Now, when Lady Macbeth does this, she's accusing Macbeth of giving her the white heart, the emblem. So she's accusing Macbeth of being womanly, and that she, Lady Macbeth, would be ashamed to accept such a gift from such a womanly man. So really biting criticism of her husband here and telling him that he is not manly and therefore beneath her respect. But more than that she believes she is much more manly and decisive than he is. Shakespeare's audience would totally have understood this reference, and of course they would reject her because she is attacking the patriarchal role that society has given her as a subservient woman. When Macbeth ends the scene, we're used to reading these lines as proof of his feelings of guilt, and consequently he wishes that he could go back in time and not kill Duncan. But actually I don't think that's the best way to read the line, because look what he says. To know my deed, so to know what I've done, it were best not to know myself. Well, there's no mention of hell here, is there? There's no mention that he's done something that's going to damn his soul for eternity. No, what he's worried about is what he has learned about himself. He doesn't want to know this about himself. Well, what is it that he's learned? He's learned that his bloodlust will lead him to kill Duncan. He hasn't really killed Duncan in order to become king himself, because if he has, then there would be no sense in the knocking waking Duncan up. That would bring Duncan back and Macbeth couldn't be king. It's not that he's worried about. What he's worried about is this moment of self-discovery, because once he realises that his hamartia is his bloodlust, he realises there's no going back. He will never be able to enjoy being king because he will constantly still have this bloodlust. And of course, being king, there'll be very little to stand in his way. He'll be able to kill whoever he likes. And that's exactly what happens in the play.